Hi everyone. Our first unit in APES focuses on ecosystems, and the majority of the unit's going to be review from things you probably learned in middle school science or in living environment. And so we'll move through this fairly quickly. There will be some new information here, some new details, but a lot of it is going to be review for you. So we're going to start with topic 1.1, in which we just get a general idea of ecosystems. They're scaled, some definitions, some different factors that impact ecosystems. So when we think about an ecosystem by definition is some location that is on Earth, on the biosphere, that has some mix of interacting factors, both living factors, which we call biotic factors, as well as abiotic factor, which are non-living components of the ecosystem. And so both of those things interacting, influencing each other are what make up an ecosystem. And in some cases, ecosystem boundaries are quite clear and defined, such as a lake ecosystem. We can really clearly see the edge of the lake, and that defines the boundaries of that, or a stream or a cave. Other times, the boundaries of ecosystems can be more unclear, that one type of ecosystem can sort of fade into another, sort of thinking about maybe a backyard ecosystem that has sort of some unmowed, untended areas leading into a forest, where you have the lawn, where you have the forest, and the boundary between those is not quite as clear. We also know that the scale of ecosystem, we talk about scale, we're talking about the size of an ecosystem. It can vary very, very significantly. We can have ecosystems that are very small. We can imagine a hole in a tree filled with water with bacteria and protists living in it. That can be considered a very small ecosystem. Inside of a mammal's digestive tract, the gut ecosystem, which is teeming with bacteria and other abiotic factors, that can be a small ecosystem. Or an ecosystem be quite large, like the North Atlantic Ocean ecosystem. And one large ecosystem can, within it, contain smaller ecosystems interacting with each other and with materials flowing from one ecosystem to another. So the scale of ecosystems can vary drastically. This image sort of shows a conception of that, of a little hollow in a tree with a few various species and water and so forth, to huge ecosystems that covers multiple states, multiple areas in and around Yellowstone National Park. And these are both considered ecosystems, but at widely different scales. We know that in ecosystems, we're going to talk a lot in this unit about energy. Okay, all organisms need a source of energy to maintain life activities. Okay, and how organisms obtain that energy varies depending on the type of organism. So autotrophs, or producers, are those organisms that can absorb energy from the sun, use it in photosynthesis to produce molecules that they can then use to extract energy from. Autotrophs and producers are transforming energy from sunlight into other forms of energy stored in molecules of glucose and ATP and other materials as well. When we think about autotrophs, we generally are thinking about plants, things like algae and a couple other organisms, but generally we're thinking of plants. Heterotrophs, or consumers, are those organisms that cannot make their own energy through the process of photosynthesis. They must obtain their energy by consuming other organisms. Some consumers consume plants. We call them herbivores, things like this white-tailed deer. Others are considered predators. They consume other animals to obtain energy. This wolf, for example, that has eaten a caribou, is an example of a predator who has preyed on another organism. But all of these organisms require energy, and the ultimate source of that energy, we know, can be traced back to the sun. We also know that within ecosystems, there are various types of relationships that exist. And one type is a very close relationship in which organisms live long-term very closely with one another. And we call these types of relationships symbiosis. And there's different types of symbiotic relationships. We'll talk about 3 of them. One is called mutualism. In this relationship of mutualism, both of the species that are in this relationship are benefiting in some way. They're increasing their chance of survival. They're increasing their chances of reproduction by participating in this relationship. And we'll talk about some examples here in a minute. Commensalism is a relationship in which one organism is benefiting, it's increasing its chances of survival or reproduction, but the organism it's living in association with is not affected. It doesn't benefit, but it also is not being harmed. So this is an example called commensalism. And then the third, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is parasitism. In parasitism, one of the organisms in the relationship is benefiting, but it's at the expense. It's harming another species. We call that the host, and decreasing the host's chance of survival and reproduction. So these are the three types of symbiotic relationships. And here are some examples of those relationships. Mutualism, when both organisms are benefiting. Pollinators, such as this bee in the flower of the plant it's pollinating. Pollinators, like bees, obtain food from the plant that it's feeding from, often in the form of nectar. But at the same time, the pollinators get pollen on them, and as they visit another flower, that pollen is spread, allowing for reproduction. So the pollinator, such as the bee, is benefiting, and so is the plant in this case. This is an acacia tree. These spikes are acacia thorns, and they're hollow, and inside of them lives an ant. And this ant and this acacia tree have evolved this beneficial to both species mutualistic relationships. The ants defend the acacia tree from herbivores. They'll go out and they'll sting and they'll irritate herbivores so that they don't eat the acacia tree. At the same time, the acacia tree provides a living space for these ants and provides nutrition as well. So both species in this case are benefiting. In parasitism, one organism benefits, one's being harmed. This top example here is the tongue-eating louse. This is a type of arthropod that acts as a parasite on different species of fish. What this tongue-eating louse does is it enters the fish through the gills, attaches to the base of the tongue, it severs the blood vessels so that the actual tongue of this fish dies and falls off. And then the louse attaches itself there in the mouth and almost acts as the tongue of the fish. It feeds on blood from the fish and mucus within the fish, so it's benefiting. But the fish's survival is decreased. Fish that are affected by this tongue-eating louse have lower weight than fish that are not affected, so it's decreasing its chances of survival. If you ever watched the TV series or played the game The Last of Us, this is the cordyceps fungus. This is a fungus that infects insects typically, and not humans right now, and infects these insects, and it grows inside of their bodies, actually will infect their brain, changing the behavior of these insects. Oftentimes it causes them to climb up trees or plants, and then eventually the cordyceps fungus kills the insect. It fruits. These are the fruiting bodies, the reproductive bodies of this fungus. They break through the exoskeleton where they release spores, which can then go on and infect other insects. So again, this is a parasitic relationship. Obviously, the insect is being harmed. It's being killed in this relationship while the cordyceps fungus is benefiting. Birds nesting in trees would be an example of commensalism. The birds are benefiting, but it's not affecting the tree in any way. Or this egret that hitches a ride on the elephant's back. When the elephant kicks up dirt, the egret will often eat insects that get exposed. It's hitching a ride, but it's not really benefiting the elephant in any way. So this is also commensalism. And finally, another relationship that is typically found in many ecosystems is competition. In competition, individuals are struggling to obtain the same limited resource. It can be competition for mates, could be competition for living space, could be for water, for light, for food, to avoid predators. These are all forms of competition. And when resources are limited, species that have what we call the same niche, the same general role in an ecosystem, they want the same resources. When two organisms share the same niche, they're going to compete. Okay? And what sometimes happens in situations when there is competition is something that's called resource partitioning. For example, these are a series of different species of warblers. And these warblers feed in these trees, as you can see. But when they are all present in the same area, they actually alter their niche to reduce the amount of competition. When they live in the same areas, the Blackburnian warbler feeds sort of on the upper reaches and outer edges of the trees. The black-throated warbler has a slightly different niche, etc. And so these species of birds are avoiding some part of this competition by changing and altering their niche slightly. If they were isolated and there was only, for example, the Cape May warbler in one geographic area, it would likely feed throughout the tree. It wouldn't limit itself to a certain area. But in times of competition, resource partitioning can happen to reduce the negative impacts of competition. And finally, these graphs show a very famous experiment by a Russian scientist called Gauss. And this scientist did an experiment with paramecium, small protists. And Gauss grew these protists in isolated containers. And we can see the blue graphs represent the population changes in these two different species of paramecium over a period of three weeks or so. And when they were in isolation, you could see the population level that each species reached, both around 200. But when Gauss grew these two species in a mixed population, okay, holding all the other resources steady, what he found was that Paramecium aurelia grew to lower levels, but higher levels, and the Paramecium caudatum was basically displaced until it eventually was almost unable to survive in this mixed medium where it had to compete for food. So oftentimes when we have two species competing, one will win out, and the other species might die out or might have to alter its niche in some way to reduce that level of competition.